It's one thing to learn about the basics of writing scenes, but it's quite another to put it into practice. It's the difference between someone telling you how to swing a golf club and actually launching a ball straight down the middle of the fairway. Putting structure to scenes and writing them effectively often feels awkward at first, but over time, we get better and better at taking our concept of a scene and executing it in such a way that the structure is transparent to the reader and what's on the page is immersive and engrossing. Examples of scene development and the eventual published prose can help a ton, which is why I'm dedicating this video to dissecting a scene from one of my published novels, 12 Kings and Sharakhai. The purpose here is to dig deep into what a scene looks like in terms of structure, but also execution, so that you can pull lessons from it and start to cement some of the concepts around how to devise structure and execute scenes for maximum effect. The scene we're going to be looking at is an action scene where a trap is sprung on the main character. And it's not even a trap meant for them, it's actually meant for someone else, but the main character is caught up in it. 12 Kings and Sharakhai is epic fantasy, but keep in mind that the concepts I'm going to illustrate are universal. They'll apply to mysteries, romance, thrillers, and more. This is something new to the channel that I've been planning for quite some time. It's the opening installment of a series of videos where I'll be looking at various types of scenes, including action scenes, mystery, suspense, battle scenes, hellacious arguments, romantic scenes, and more. If you have specific scene types you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment below. And also, I'm actively looking for feedback on if this is helpful and if there's anything I could add, change, or remove to make it more useful. If you have any thoughts, please let me know in the comments below. One last thing before we dive in. If you're looking for ways to up your writing game, I have a whole series of mastering fiction videos, which you can find up here. The one most applicable is the video on scene structure, but the series as a whole takes you from the earliest brainstorming phases of a novel all the way through plotting, writing, and editing. Shameless plug made. Let's dive in and see what this action scene is all about. Hey, if you're new to the channel, I'm Brad Bollier, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author with a dozen novels, tons of short stories, and 20 plus years of experience in the field of writing. I started a novel approach to share hard-earned lessons on writing, editing, publishing, and the business of writing, which I hope will help you along your journey. If that sounds up your alley, be sure to subscribe, and if you find this video useful, I hope you'll like, share, and maybe even buy me a coffee on coffee.com. Link in the description below. Okay, so before we dive in, I want to set the stage a little bit. So I mentioned this is from 12 Kings and Sharakhai. It's the third chapter early on in the story. 12 Kings is Game of Thrones meets Arabian Nights. It's an epic fantasy that focuses on Cheta, who we can see on the right-hand side there on the cover of 12 Kings, a swordswoman in Sharakhai who loses her mother when she's young. And since then, Cheta has dedicated her life to toppling the 12 Kings who rule the city and the desert with iron fists. The scene itself follows Cheta and her best friend Emery. They travel through a spice market. That's kind of preamble. And Cheta tries to recruit Emery for a clandestine package delivery. She has just come from a meeting with Osman, who is the man who runs the pits. He has other businesses that he runs, some above board, some below board. And he's asked her to run a package across the city. And the reason this is needed is because one of the kings, each of the kings has different abilities granted by the gods. And one of them is the Whisper King. And so he's able to hear, and he's even drawn to different conversations that people are having that are conspiring against the kings, that are wishing them ill will or planning things against them. And so people like the Moonless Host, who are hoping to bring down the kings as well, run messages, encoded messages across the city to different people so that they're not picked up by the Whisper King. And so Cheta tries to recruit Emery, and they reach an area of perfume vendors within the spice market. It's inside of this old repurposed fortification, and the Moonless Host is about to spring a trap. And at first, Cheta has no idea why. So this is going to follow the video that I did on scene structure. And the basic structure is some statement of a goal early on. Either it's implied from what the character has talked about in previous scenes, or it's either stated or thought of an internal monologue on the part of the main character, the POV character for that scene. And then there's the introduction and development of conflict, and finally the failure of the character to reach his or her goals, some tactical disaster. In that video, I talked about having successes in certain scenes, and that's typically in subplots, but this is the pattern that most scenes will follow. So an example, the Fellowship in the Fellowship of the Ring must reach Bree, and they do, but they are chased by the Nine, the riders sent by Sauron along the way. So we have something like this, a statement of a goal at the beginning of a scene, and then the introduction and development of conflict, and finally some disaster. So in this case, the Moonless Host, a group that is hoping to bring down the kings, similar to Cheta, but they're much more ruthless about it. They spring a trap, and we don't know why at first, in fact. So within this fort where these perfume vendors are, they barricade both entrances to it, and then they light a fire. They douse it with lamp oil and light a fire. So the goal here is just to make it out alive. And the conflict, of course, is Cheta is trapped in the old tower, and this fire is set ablaze, so she has to survive and maybe help others survive as well. And the disaster is a king was there. That's why the fire was set. And Cheta wants to follow through on her vow to kill him, but she fails to do so. And so I like to have a bit more than that as I'm working through scenes. And so you might have some kind of template that you create where you detail some of these things, or at least mentally note them. So I like to have, in addition to those three things I just mentioned, things like the characters. So in this case, we have Cheta, Emery, different market goers that they interact with, and the vendors, the Moonless Host, a king, and two blade maidens, two protectors of the king. Also, some kind of lead-in, like where's this coming from? Why is this even happening? In this case, as I mentioned, Cheta had this talk with Osman, and she took on this mission to deliver a package, and she wants Emery to help her. There's a decoy and a primary one, and so she needs two people to do it. And so it's good to think about what part scenes are playing in your novel, and part of that comes from where is this scene coming from? Why is it taking place at all? What purpose is it serving for the main character? And then the setting. So in this case, we have tight quarters. We're in an old stone tower repurposed as a section of the spice market where these perfume vendors are. The immediate goal is to make it out alive, but I like to think as well, just as I think about the lead-in, like where things are coming from, I also like to have an idea of where things are headed. And so I think about the larger goal. And so here I want to do things like complicate Sharakhai and make it more real, show the good and the bad to the reader and make them worry over Cheta and Emery's package run. So not just worry about the current scene, but this raises the stakes and makes the reader understand how dangerous things are for Cheta and Emery to do things like oppose the kings in any way. And then we have the conflict itself. Cheta is trapped in the old tower. This fire is set ablaze. She has to make it out. And then the disaster is a king of Sharakhai is there, and Cheta fails to kill him. He is the reason that trap was set in the first place. And the fallout. What happens because of it? It's not just how things affect the main character, which is kind of what that larger goal is about, but what else happens? How do the antagonists in this case respond? And so the kings deliver payback, which we'll see. I also want to note that there are two types of action scenes. There are reactive ones and proactive ones. This one happens to be reactive, and that's fairly common early on when the main character or characters don't really know what's going on yet, and the antagonists are acting in some way, and so they're pulled into things without really trying. They're just caught up in it. That can also happen later on in the story as the antagonists work to stop the heroes from doing whatever they're doing to try to stop them. As things move along from the beginning, things will start to turn more proactive. I'll be making a video soon on a chase scene that is more proactive, so you can see that kind of action scene. But just keep in mind that this is reactive, and you'll be making choices along the way with how the story, how the antagonists, how the world might be acting against the main characters and also how they'll be acting themselves to try to fix things or gain whatever it is they want to gain. And also keep in mind that this can apply to all kinds of stories, from romance, mystery, thrillers, etc. This type of reactive scene in a romance, for example, could be the main character meeting their love interest for the first time, the person they're trying to get with by the end of the story. Whereas proactive might be them trying to set up a date or meet them at a random party or something like that. Okay, so here we are in 12 Kings and Sharakhai. As I mentioned, this is very early. This is chapter 3, where Cheta meets up with Emery and they go through the spice market into this old tower. I'm going to get rid of the binder for the time being because I'm going to focus on just this scene. And it's in a chapter that starts with a smaller scene where Cheta is training a young girl named Mala. As a way for Cheta to give back to the community, she's started to train other people in how to use the swords, especially young girls. And she is a gladiator to make money sometimes. She wears many hats in the city. And so she has this scene with Mala. I'm going to skip past that because what I want to focus on is the scene in the spice market and the old tower itself. And so I'm gonna scroll through this quickly and not focus on this, but she does eventually meet up with Emery and they start walking through the spice market. I mentioned that she would try to entice Emery into coming with her on this mission that Osman gave her, which she does as they walk through the spice market. So quite a bit happens in this chapter before we get to the scene that we care about. So I'm going to scroll forward a bit until we come here, and I'm going to notate all the things that I want to talk about in more detail in this green underline. And so, as I mentioned, she talks to Emery and he agrees. And that's where this begins. He's just agreed. And then they pass through this stone archway into the ruins of an old fort that had long since surrendered to the ever-growing market, the spice market. And so we have some setup here, some setting. We describe the area that they go into. Again, it's an old tower that's kind of been hollowed out that they walk into. And within it is a number of merchants who are selling perfumes. And so I have a little bit of back and forth just to kind of set the stage. I want the reader to see that there are innocent people in this place before we get to the fire. And so they talk a little bit with the vendors, the hawkers, who are trying to get them to buy some of the perfume. And then we get to this spot. Cheta laughed, waving her hands to indicate she was willing to try this perfume the girl was trying to sell her. But before she could speak, a bustle arose from the far end of the enclosed fort, where several merchants stood near an expensively dressed man. So it's not totally uncommon for expensively dressed people to be in the spice market, but I wanted to draw attention to it. And so the patron was not only tall, but imposing. I need to describe him. This is the king that we realize is a king later on. He is in disguise. The kings don't get out a lot, and some of them feel cooped up in the palaces that they have on this mountain in the middle of Sharakhai. And so some of them sneak out in disguise just to experience the city that they used to walk around freely in. And so Cheta thinks he might be a lord of Malasan or a caravan master, perhaps even a prince. Just trying to give a sense of flavor here and just how expensive his clothes are. And then two women, young enough that they might have been his daughters, trailed behind him, chatting gaily with one another. Cheta saw through them immediately. And so one of the things I want to call out here is Cheta notices them and then she sizes them up immediately. And this does two things. It kind of describes these two women trailing behind the expensively dressed man, but it also starts to characterize Cheta as capable, wary, streetwise, that sort of thing. And it's done with this very short sentence. Cheta saw through them immediately. We don't even know what she saw exactly, which is why in the very next paragraph, I describe it. So they were careful, but she saw them scanning the space, measuring those closest before moving on to those farther away. They looked for weapons first and then watched the faces of those gathered as if memorizing what they saw. When the one in a flowing yellow dress spotted Cheta, she stopped for a moment. The two of them locked eyes, and Cheta suddenly found her heart beating like it did before a bout in the pits. And so she's a pit fighter. She's a gladiatorial fighter in the city, Cheta is. She fights in the pits for money, but also to keep herself in training and able to do what she wants to do in the end, which is defeat the kings. And so she locks eyes with this woman, and Cheetah's heart is starting to beat like it did before, about in the pits, without even realizing exactly why. Cheetah knows something is up, and she knows these other women. She sees herself in them. She sees another fighter in these two women. In the very next short paragraph, what is it, Emery asked. So this paints Emery and Cheetah as intimate, as friends. They know each other so well that Emery can pick up on her mood without her really saying anything. We get the sense that he picks up on her suddenly stiff attitude, right? Her wariness. And so that paints them both. And so one of the lessons I want you to pick up as we're going through this is that you want to do things like this, character interactions, as economically as possible. We're always talking about, as writers and editors, as we try to revise our manuscripts, trying to cut out the unnecessary words. And this is part of how you do that. You do things by inference. There's so much subtext here that I don't have to go into a lot of detail about Cheetah and Emery being friends. I assume that, and then I paint that as the chapters and scenes move on. Okay, so Emery says, what is it? And Cheetah just shakes her head and looked away lest the woman sense something amiss. So Cheetah's trying to hide that she kind of knows something is going on here. And then, before Cheetah could move, the sound of wooden wheels clattering over stone came from behind. Someone shouted, though what was said was lost in a terrible clatter of heavy wood as it rattled against the stones of the old fort. Cheetah turned. The opening before her, the one she and Emery had used to enter the fort, had just been cut off by some massive contraption of stacked logs. The high sound of hammers pounding metal on metal came from somewhere beyond it. And so this would be pretty disconcerting if you were inside that tower. Cheetah recognizes immediately something terrible is about to happen. One way of getting out of this tower has been cut off, and we see in just a minute that the other way is cut off too. There's one way in, one way out of this tower. So we see dust sifting down, conversations vanish like crows before a storm, and then many simply stared at the barrier because they're just like, what the heck is going on? But not the two women. One of them remained near her lord. The other ran for the only other passageway out of the fort. But before she'd taken 2 steps toward, another set of timbers smashes into place and traps them inside of this tower. So right after that, the woman, how she'd hidden it from sight, Cheetah had no clue, was suddenly holding a dark sword in her hand, a shamshir made of nearly black metal. So it's an ebon blade, and only blade maidens use them. And blade maidens are the daughters of the kings. They are largely there to protect the kings, but sometimes they're assigned to important people in Sharakhai. And so Cheetah thinks the man must be important to demand a pair of maidens as escorts. She doesn't yet realize that he's a king, because it's so rare for that to happen, for them to be just seen out and about in Sharakhai, especially some place that's kind of poorer-ish as the spice market. So then we have to introduce the moonless host and the danger that Cheetah and the others are in. So there's a shadow cast along the stones, and Cheetah looks up and she sees the sun-backed silhouettes of 4 men wearing black turbans and veils, the moonless host. And so they're muscling something over the edge of the stone walls. And so their bladders filled with lamp oil. And so they tumble and splash, and the scent of the lamp oil fills this space. And so we're amping up the tension. People are starting to freak out at this point. And of course, Cheetah and Emery, Cheetah especially, because she's our POV character, is starting to get very scared about what's about to happen. And so I also wanted to be able to describe and show the reader that the Blade Maidens especially are very, very capable. They're like special forces for the kings. And so it had only begun to register who the men were above and what they had dropped when one of the maidens took 2 long strides toward the wall with her ebon sword in hand. And so she launches herself and she climbs up the inside of this tower in this amazing feat that most people could only dream of, right? And so she gets to the top, 40 feet in the blink of an eye. And so we're starting to get a sense of what Blade Maidens are like and what Cheetah is up against when she goes to face the kings. It's not just the kings. She is surrounded by the Silver Spears, kind of the regulars of the army, but also the Blade Maidens, again, highly trained individuals who are more than ready to stop her if she tries to harm one of the kings. And then the other maiden was using her fingers to test the stone, the wall of the tower, this old tower. So she is kind of searching around. She's looking for an escape path, basically. And so she finds a weakened stone, in essence, and then she starts to kick it so she can push it through and form an escape path for her king. And so she does that. She breaks through and does eventually make way. And then still throughout all this, Cheta is still sort of thinking that this man is just some lord. But amidst all the madness, the lord the maidens protected stood with such tranquility it made Cheta go cold. She has kind of like these spidey senses, this sixth sense, because she's been through a lot at this point. She's been through a lot of combat. She's also kind of a thiefy type of character. She's very capable. And then the man meets Cheta's eyes, perhaps sensing her stare. And that's when Cheta realizes he was not merely calm, he was serene. Sure, he was in no danger whatsoever. He was no visiting lord. He was one of the 12 kings. And so now once she realizes that, I need to give a sense that Cheta does have a purpose where it comes to the kings. So like all her thoughts about like the fire that's about to break out, the danger that she's in, and all the other people in the market just like vanishes. And she's sort of back to her basic goal of trying to bring these kings down. And so she's just in a state of wonder. A king of Sharakhai stood in this place, disguising himself as some wealthy lord. Though why he would do such a thing, she had no idea. And so she doesn't know at this point that this particular king goes out and about in disguise. And so this is very surprising to her. So there's a fight breaking out above with the maiden who went to the top of the tower. The other maiden is trying to break her way through the tower. And then without knowing when it had happened, Cheta realized she had her kenchar gripped tightly in her hand, her knife. She takes a step toward the king, preparing to charge, ready to kill this guy, the man who killed her mother and who she vowed to gain vengeance for. And then Emery realizes what she's doing and grabs her wrist. He's like, "What are you doing? You're going to be killed." And so Cheta is still a bit out of her mind. She breaks his grip. He tries to grab her again, but she snatched her wrist and spun him into a nearby corner, the only dry space that remained. "Stay back, Emery." So she doesn't want him hurt with what she's about to do. And then she'd only just turned back looking for the king when something bright entered her field of vision from above. It's a torch, and it's about to light everything on fire. And so even among that, even knowing what's going on, and even after the whoosh of the fire starting to spread, Cheta still wants to reach the king. It's really, I just want to paint this as a driving force behind so many of Cheta's actions in her life. And this is what helps do it, showing some of her interior monologue that makes it clear that she is very driven. So the fire starts to spread. People catch on fire, and she's still thinking, I can still reach him. But then she realizes it's getting to be too late. She's not going to make it. The fire is moving too quickly, and they engulf people as she watches. So flames now whirled between her and the king, and she's still thinking, maybe I can make one leap. But no, it was too far. The flames were too fierce. And so she realizes she has to give up on that. But then I wanted to give her something else to worry about. I still want to paint, she hasn't really done much, Cheta. And so I still want to paint her and Emery as competent, capable, courageous people. And so I had this girl that's there, and she's petrified next to Cheta, and her father is right there, and he's burning. Just a horrific scene, right? So naturally, the kid is worried about her father, wants to save him, and Cheta stops her. You know, she can't go save him. He's lost. Cheta realizes at this point he's covered in this oil and he's burning badly. She grabs the girl, draws her back, and then again, I want Emery to be painted as capable too. And so he grabs a carpet that he soaked in water, that scented water, the perfumed water that was all around, and he throws it over them. And the girl fights to get away. And so they end up saving this girl while the fire rages throughout this tower. So I play out this scene a little bit more. It's, again, really horrific for them to see. And then in the corner where the king had been standing, I want to kind of close this loop a little bit. The maiden was shoving the king through the hole she'd forced through the old stone. The flames caught up with her just as the king's legs and feet were lost from view. And so the maiden was doused in this lamp oil, and she catches fire, but she doesn't worry about herself just yet. She doesn't follow her king. She reaches down and replaces the stone after the king is through so that he is safe, so that nobody can follow to him and maybe harm him, kill him while he's vulnerable. And so only when that stone is back in place does she roll away in agony. So I'm just trying to paint again these maidens as very strong-willed, like their main purpose in life is to protect the kings and whoever the kings say to protect as well. And then Cheta stared at the black gaps around the stone where the king went through. A king now lay on the other side, crawling away, vulnerable. Her chance had come and gone in the span of moments. And so I wanted there to be a little bit of regret on Cheta's part, or the feeling like a chance was lost at least. And so the fallout of the fire continues for a little bit, but in the meantime, people have been trying to break these barriers so they can open up a way to get out of this place. And so that happens. And soon Cheta was lifted up and led out of the inferno toward the shaded aisles of the market proper, which now felt cold as ice. The girl came with her, so they saved her. And then they're questioned by the spears for a little bit. So this kind of marks the end of that scene. So that's it, beginning to end. But let me talk just a little bit and show you the fallout here. So throughout the rest of this, it's really just kind of wrapping up what happened at the scene of the fire, and then showing a little bit of the mental fallout for Cheta as she goes home and she lays awake long into the night, replaying everything that had happened. So I wind this down a little bit, and then let me just cover this last section here. So the next morning, as the Silver Spears continue their night-long sweep through the Western Quarter for intelligence, so they're looking for the Moonless Host, the people who did this, and the people who helped them, who aided them in any way. And then Cheta hears a roar far to the west, and so she leaves her home and she goes to that until she comes to Hallowsgate, this fortress. And then we see what the kings did in response to this attack by the Moonless Host. As she stared at the fortress walls, her world was reduced to the forms hanging by ropes from the battlements. Girls, Cheta realized, all girls, 24. She counted them with morbid fascination. Their throats were cut, so that it was just a very nasty way to respond to what they had done. So the kings wanted to show that for each one of us that you kill, we will kill 24 of yours. And so you will drown before we are truly harmed is the notion. So very, very out of proportion to what happened. And then we see something devastating. Cheta stared at each body in turn, giving them a remembrance, a promise, especially the last. That little perfume girl with the jet black hair and eyes like jade. So she was killed as well. And so I added her, or I actually chose to put her in here because I needed a personal connection from that event to the deaths that are being displayed for everyone to see on the fortress walls. And so I'm always trying to find ways to make a personal connection between the happenings, the events in the story, and the main POV characters. Cheta, in this case, there are other POV characters too, but I want them to react in a visceral, emotional way. And the only way you can do that is by making the events personal to them in some way. And that's how I did it in this case. So wrapping things up, the Moonless Host springs their trap. So the goal here again was to make it out alive. And the conflict was Cheta was trapped in this old tower. This fire was set ablaze. And finally, the king that was there, and then she realizes halfway through, escapes and she fails to kill him. So what did this scene accomplish? Well, it did other things besides what we talked about. It deepened our understanding of Sharakhai and its people, the Moonless Host, the kings and the Blade Maidens, the bloody history of their conflict, the tactics they're willing to employ. So as we're working through different scenes, we're trying to do more than just complete the goal. We're trying to reach beyond that and start to think about the world that we're in. So for example, what are the people like in this city of Sharakhai? What is the spice market like? What are the smells and the feel of the air, the dryness? What is it like to live in Sharakhai? Also, it showed what makes Cheta tick. We saw her desire to kill the kings, and it made it real. We understood on an intellectual level that she wanted that to happen, but we didn't feel it yet until this chapter, when she sees one of the kings and really wants to kill them. It also puts added pressure on the mission Cheta spoke to Emery about. That may seem to the reader like it would be pretty easy, but now it's much more dangerous. The danger anyone puts themselves in opposing the kings in any small way is made much more real when we see something like this and the consequences that happen. And so the reader will feel the tension ratchet up just by having witnessed all this happen as Cheta and Emery later are going on that package run. So a few things of note. The scene was not static. Things were constantly changing, and you want to make sure you do that in really all your scenes, but especially action scenes, which can sometimes get a little bit static, a little bit circular, and things may not feel like they're moving forward, or they feel like a one-note type of scene. Also, the tension escalated throughout. It started out really calm, right? And then these bladders dropped and people were at the top of the tower or the moonless host, and we didn't know why they were there yet. And then the fire starts and then it spreads and the king gets away. So we're constantly trying to amp up the tension throughout the scenes as they play out. And we amplify that by sensory input from the main character and Chayda's reactions, both external and internal, her internal monologue. Also, the scene was emotional and personal to Chayda. So it was an action scene, but the events touched on her own personal goals. And so one of the things you want to try to do as you're working up or writing action scenes is to just make it personal for the main character or the POV character, and that will make it personal for the reader. I mentioned this concept in a number of my videos, the Mastering Fiction series, about world, character, and plot interacting. And I use it as a way to think about developing any one of these three pillars. So if you're working on characters, you might think about where this is taking place and the sort of people that might inhabit it. So in other words, the world is advising you on character. Or if you have a certain plot point that you want to have, like a chase scene or something, then you need people to be chasing them. And so that may advise on character. The actual chase scene might be through the desert on sand ships or on horses or what have you. It might be set in space, and if you're writing a science fiction story, the types of technologies available might advise you on how that chase scene will go and who'll be performing it. So the notion here is that these just constantly interact with one another, and if you're stuck in any way, look to the other two to see if they can help you. And so in this case, I had a king. I knew he was going to be attacked, and I knew the moonless hosts were going to do it, and Chayda and Emery were going to be caught up in it. But where to put them? How were they going to trap the king in some way so that he couldn't just escape? And why was the king alone in the first place? That advised me on that king's character. He feels cooped up, and so he wanted to get out and visit the city that he grew up in. And so him as a king would have a couple blade maidens with him, and so that kind of advised on how things would play out within that tower as they're trapped, how the fight would progress at the top of the tower as people were burning below. My advice here is just to keep this stuff in mind as you're working out scenes to see what you can pull in to help the reader experience this world and this story and these characters. But also, if you're stuck, look to the other pillars. Whatever you're trying to think about, the plot actually might advise you on world. The characters that you need might dictate that the world be a certain way, that sort of thing. So just use that as a tool to help you flesh out your story and your world and your characters. I want to take a quick moment to just say thank you for subscribing and spreading the word about the channel. I've been finishing up A Curse of Crown and Brute, book 3 in my Book of the Whole trilogy, and also organizing and starting the audio production for book 2, A God of Countless Guises. Be sure to hit subscribe for a video on how to tackle audiobooks. In the meantime, this little channel has reached 5,000 subscribers plus at this point, and that's thanks to you. I appreciate the support, and please keep it coming. I hope that deep dive into an action scene helped to clarify how to approach similar scenes in your own writing. You won't use it as any sort of blueprint, of course. My hope is that you're able to see the structure of an action scene and some of the rules around it and apply those lessons learned to your own exciting action sequences. As always, I hope you'll like, subscribe, and share this with fellow writers and writer groups. I have a ton more videos planned on writing, publishing, and how to get the most out of Scrivener. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.